Before we begin, hit that subscribe button right now, because the story you're about to hear is the kind that doesn't just entertain you. It changes the way you look at the people in your life who are quietly, patiently waiting. This is a story about a man who was laughed at a dinner table, in front of his wife, in front of people who called themselves family. A man who never raised his voice, never made a threat, never asked for an apology. He just went back to work. And 3 years later, the very same people who laughed at him showed up at his office with their hats in their hands and their company on the verge of collapse. Stay with me, because what happened next is not what any of them expected. It was a Thursday night in November when Emily Caldwell's parents decided, without meaning to make the worst mistake of their lives. The setting was their family home in Lincoln Park, Chicago. A 4-story brownstone with a limestone fireplace, a dining room that seated 12 comfortably, and a wine cellar that her father, Richard Caldwell, liked to tell people had cost more than most people's first cars. The occasion was simple, a welcome dinner. Emily had been married to Daniel for 6 months, and this was the first time the Caldwells had gathered the extended family to formally meet him. Daniel Hayes sat at the far end of the table, next to Emily. He wore a dark blazer, pressed, clean, the same one he wore for parent-teacher conferences. He had brought a bottle of wine and a handwritten card for Emily's mother. His hands, Emily noticed, were completely steady. Daniel always had steady hands. That was the first thing Emily had noticed about him when they met at a school fundraiser 4 years ago. While everyone around him buzzed with noise and ambition, Daniel moved quietly, deliberately, like a man who had decided exactly who he was and stopped needing anyone to confirm it. But the Caldwells didn't know that yet. What they knew was this: their daughter, their only daughter, raised in Lincoln Park, educated at Northwestern, offered a VP role at her father's company at 27, had married a public school history teacher from the South Side. Richard Caldwell, Emily's father, said, "So Daniel, tell us about what you do." The pause before what you do was exactly 1 beat too long. Emily felt it. The whole table felt it. Daniel said, "I teach high school history, American history mostly, 11th grade, Chicago public schools." Richard Caldwell didn't laugh immediately. He waited. He picked up his wine glass, swirled it once, a habit he had acquired to signal that he was thinking, and then looked at Daniel with an expression that managed to be polite and devastating at the same time. Richard said, "A teacher. Well, that's noble, I suppose." The word noble landed on the table like a stone. Emily's mother, Patricia, reached for the breadbasket. Her uncle Roy, who had made his money flipping commercial real estate, chuckled softly into his napkin. Her cousin Brendan, 24 years old and working his first year at Richard's firm, didn't bother to hide his smirk. Richard said, "I always thought with Emily's background, the connections we have, she'd end up with someone in, a growth field. Finance, development, law, maybe." He wasn't speaking to Daniel anymore. He was speaking around him, as if Daniel were a piece of furniture that had been brought into the room by mistake. Daniel said, "I understand, it's a different kind of work." Richard said, "Different. Yes. I mean, what does a teacher make these days? What is it, 50, 60,000? He said the number the way you might say the price of a used appliance. Not mean, exactly. Just small. Roy, uncle, said, "Ha, my accountant makes more than that, and she works 4 days a week." More laughter. Softer this time, but there. Emily's hand found Daniel's under the tablecloth. He squeezed it once, calm, like a man who had heard worse and survived it. Later that night, driving home on the 290 with the city lights sliding past the window, Emily said she was sorry. Daniel said, "Don't be. They love you. They just don't know me yet." Emily said, "They were rude, Daniel." Daniel said, "They were scared. People mock what they don't understand. It's the oldest reflex in the world." He drove with one hand on the wheel and the other holding her hand. The radio played softly. He didn't seem broken. He didn't seem angry. He seemed somehow already past it. Emily, watching the highway lights, thought, "I married the right man." She had no idea, not yet, just how right. Daniel grew up in Inglewood, one of Chicago's most underserved neighborhoods. His mother worked the night shift at a hospital laundry. His father left before Daniel's 8th birthday. He was raised in a 2-bedroom apartment with his grandmother, his aunt, and 3 cousins, all sharing one bathroom and one refrigerator that was never quite full. He got a full scholarship to the University of Illinois based on an essay he wrote about Frederick Douglass. His professor called it the most sophisticated historical analysis she had seen from an 18-year-old. After graduating with honors, Daniel was offered a position at a consulting firm downtown. A real salary, a real office, a career path that Richard Caldwell would have recognized and approved of. He turned it down because Daniel had made a decision, quiet, private, unannounced, that he was going to go back to the neighborhood that built him. He was going to teach, not because he couldn't do anything else, because he believed, with the stubborn certainty of someone who had been saved by a good teacher himself, that education was the most important work in the world. His students called him Mr. Hayes. Some of them called him the only adult who actually showed up. He didn't talk about this at dinner tables. He didn't bring it up at family gatherings. He went to work every morning at 6:45 a.m. and came home at 6 p.m. and graded papers at the kitchen table while Emily made dinner, and that was it. He didn't need anyone's permission to know his work had value. The idea began, as most great ideas do, with a problem that had no solution and one person who refused to accept that. In his 3rd year of teaching, Daniel was assigned to a failing school on the west side, Jefferson High. Jefferson had a dropout rate above 40%. It had a principal who changed every 2 years. It had teachers who were exhausted and underfunded and fighting a war with no reinforcements. Daniel spent a year studying the school the way he studied history, not looking for someone to blame, but looking for the pattern underneath the surface. What he found surprised people when he eventually said it out loud. The problem wasn't the students. It wasn't even the teachers. The problem was structural isolation. These schools operated as islands, no connection to each other, no shared resources, no coordinated approach. Every teacher reinventing the wheel in a different classroom, alone. Daniel wrote a 14-page proposal on a weekend in February. He called it the Illinois Bridge Education Initiative. The concept was simple. Pair struggling schools with resource-rich schools in a shared curriculum network. Build cross-school mentorship programs for students. Create teacher exchange weeks where educators from different schools share methods. He sent the proposal to 3 organizations. All 3 rejected it. He revised it, sent it to 4 more, 2 rejections, 2 no replies. Emily, gently one evening, "Daniel, maybe you should take a break from this." "Daniel, I'm going to get it right. It just needs the right framing." He sat at that kitchen table for 2 more weekends. He rewrote the proposal. He added data. He found a retired principal named Margaret Okafor who believed in the idea and agreed to co-sign her name to it. On the 11th submission, a small educational foundation in Evanston, someone called back. His name was James Whitfield. He was 61 years old, a former superintendent, and he said 4 words that Daniel would remember for the rest of his life. "This is the one." While Daniel was rebuilding schools on the South Side with grant money and borrowed time, the Caldwell family was doing what the Caldwell family always did: expanding. Richard Caldwell Development had been a Chicago institution for 30 years. Commercial real estate, office buildings, mixed-use developments, luxury condominiums in neighborhoods that were being revitalized, which was a word that meant different things depending on who said it. The company had grown under Richard's leadership from a small firm to a 40-person operation with a portfolio worth nearly $300 million. But there was a problem building under the surface. The problem had a name: Westbridge. Westbridge was a massive mixed-use development on the city's west side, a neighborhood that sat directly adjacent to several of the schools in Daniel's network. Richard had acquired the land 3 years earlier, betting that gentrification would accelerate and the investment would return double. But the neighborhood didn't gentrify, and the development stalled. and the cost overruns mounted. And a series of decisions, some careless, one or two that were worse than careless, began to surface. There were questions about permits, about a community benefits agreement that had been signed and not honored, about displacement of families from 3 residential blocks. The questions became an investigation. The investigation became a story in the Tribune. The story became a scandal. By the time winter came in year 3, 3 years after that dinner table, 3 years after Noble, I suppose, Caldwell Development was under federal scrutiny. 2 major institutional clients had quietly walked away, and the company's bank had called in a loan review. Richard Caldwell, for the first time in 30 years, didn't know what to do next. The article ran in the Chicago Tribune on a Tuesday morning in March. Page A1, below the fold, with a photograph. The headline read, "Illinois Bridge Initiative expands to 60 schools, cited as national model for urban education reform." The photograph showed Daniel standing in a school gymnasium surrounded by students and teachers from 5 different schools, a moment from the annual bridge summit he'd organized. He was laughing at something someone had said. He looked like a man who had found exactly where he belonged. The article described how the program had reduced dropout rates by 31% across participating schools, how it had been adopted as a template by school districts in Detroit and Baltimore, how the U.S. Department of Education had invited Daniel to present at a national conference, how he had turned down 3 private sector offers to stay with the nonprofit. Patricia Caldwell read the article twice. She read it at the kitchen table in Lincoln Park, in the same chair where she had reached for the breadbasket 3 years ago, while her husband delivered his verdict on Daniel's worth. She read the part where a student named Marcus, now a junior at Northwestern, said that the bridge program was the reason he hadn't dropped out at 16. She read the quote from the state superintendent of schools who called Daniel one of the most consequential education reformers working in America today. She folded the paper. She sat with it for a long time. Then she walked upstairs to where Richard was on a conference call about the federal investigation, knocked once on the door, and slid the paper underneath it without saying a word. Richard picked it up 30 minutes later when the call ended. He read it once. Then he set it down on his desk, next to a stack of legal documents, and stared at the photograph of his son-in-law for a very long time. The federal investigation concluded 6 weeks later with findings that were worse than Richard's lawyers had prepared him for. 2 executives at Caldwell Development had signed off on falsified community impact assessments. The displaced families from the West Bridge project were represented by a civil rights attorney who was building a restitution case. 3 institutional investors, a pension fund, a university endowment, and a regional bank, formally withdrew from future projects pending the outcome. The company wasn't bankrupt, not yet, but it was hemorrhaging credibility, which in real estate is a currency that matters more than cash. The bank scheduled a loan review for the following month. 2 of Richard's largest remaining clients, a hotel chain and a healthcare developer, sent letters requesting meetings. The kind of meetings where people don't come to talk, they come to exit. Richard Caldwell had built his company on reputation, and now the reputation was gone. On a Wednesday evening in April, Richard sat in his home office and did something he hadn't done since his company's first year. He made a list of every possible path forward. He needed a partner, not a financial partner. The money could be restructured. He needed a reputational partner, an organization that had credibility in the communities that Caldwell Development had harmed, an organization that could stand next to his company at a press conference and say, "We believe in their commitment to change." He went through the list systematically. Foundations, civic organizations, universities, community groups. He crossed off names one by one. At 11:30 p.m., he stopped crossing off names because there was one organization left on the list that had undeniable credibility in exactly the communities where Caldwell Development had failed. One organization whose leadership was beyond reproach, whose track record was documented in the national press, whose mission aligned perfectly with the commitments Richard needed to make publicly. The Illinois Bridge Education Initiative. He sat with that realization for a long time. The call came to Emily's phone first, which is how Daniel knew it was deliberate. Richard didn't have Daniel's direct number, had never asked for it in 3 years, a fact that said something about the relationship without needing to be said out loud. Emily handing Daniel the phone and said, "It's my father. He wants to talk to you." Daniel was at the kitchen table, grading papers, as always. Red pen in one hand, a cup of coffee going cold beside it. He took the phone. He didn't put it on speaker. Emily watched his face. "Richard." "Daniel, this is Richard. Do you have a few minutes?" Daniel answered, "Sure, Richard." Richard explained the situation. Not all of it. He kept it formal, executive level, the way he talked to attorneys. But the core of it came through. The company was in trouble. They needed to demonstrate a genuine commitment to the communities the Westbridge project had failed. They needed a credible nonprofit partner to co-sign that commitment publicly. He wanted the Illinois Bridge Initiative. Daniel listened without interrupting. When Richard finished, there was a pause, not an uncomfortable one, the kind of pause that comes from someone who is actually thinking, not performing. Daniel said, "I appreciate you calling me directly, Richard. Let me be honest with you about how this would need to work." "Of course," Richard said. Daniel said, "Any partnership with Bridge isn't a PR move. It can't be a photo opportunity or a check for a press release. If Caldwell Development partners with us, it means a real multi-year commitment to the schools in the communities affected by Westbridge. Curriculum funding, facility investment, teacher support grants." A beat of silence on Richard's end. Richard asked, "What would that look like specifically?" Daniel said, "I'll send you a proposal, but I want you to know before we go further, the communities have to feel it. Not the shareholders, not the Tribune, the families." "I understand." Daniel said he'd have something drafted by Friday. He set down the phone. Emily was looking at him from across the table. Daniel returning to his papers and said, "Your dad and I are going to meet next week." He picked up his red pen. Back to work. Daniel spent 2 evenings drafting the partnership proposal. He worked at the kitchen table after dinner, the way he worked on everything. Methodically, without urgency, without drama. When Emily looked over his shoulder one night and saw the scope of what he was asking, she put her hand on his back. "Daniel, this is a lot to ask them for." "I know, but it's what the communities actually need. If they're serious, they'll agree. If they're not serious, I don't want their name attached to ours." The proposal asked for 4 things. First, 100 fully funded 4-year scholarships for students from the 3 neighborhoods directly impacted by the Westbridge displacement to be awarded over 5 years, prioritizing first-generation college students. Second, a $3 million grant to the Bridge Initiative's Teacher Development Fund, distributed over 3 years, with no naming rights and no marketing use. Third, a community advisory board, made up of residents, educators, and former displaced families, with veto power over any future Caldwell development project in those neighborhoods. Fourth, a formal public acknowledgement of the harm done by the Westbridge project, not a legal settlement language, not a PR statement, but a direct letter from Richard Caldwell personally delivered to each of the 3 affected community organizations. Daniel sent the proposal on Friday morning. He went to school. He taught his 11th grade American history class, as he did every day. He collected essays on the New Deal. He had a meeting with a student who was falling behind. His phone buzzed at 2:15 p.m. A text from Richard, "Can we meet Monday?" They met in Daniel's office. Not at the Caldwell Development headquarters. Not at a neutral restaurant. Daniel's office, a converted classroom in a school building on the west side that Bridge used as its administrative hub. Richard arrived 5 minutes early. He wore a suit, which felt out of place in the hallway lined with student artwork and handmade academic achievement posters. He carried a legal notepad. He looked, Emily would later say, like a man who was arriving somewhere he hadn't planned to arrive. Daniel's assistant, a 23-year-old former bridge student named Kyra, offered Richard coffee and pointed him to a chair outside Daniel's door. Richard sat in that chair. He looked at the posters on the wall. There was one, a handwritten list titled, "Why I'm Still Here," with student names and their reasons. Some were small. My teacher remembers my name. Some were large, because someone told me I could go to college and I believed them. Richard sat in that chair for 6 minutes before Daniel's door opened. Daniel shook his hand. Firm. Equal. They sat across from each other. No lawyers in the room. No PR people. Just two men and a proposal on a desk. Richard, looking around the room, and said, "You've built something real here." Daniel said, "We've built it together. That's the whole point." Richard was quiet for a moment and said, "I've read your proposal 3 times. My attorney read it. My CFO read it. I'm going to be direct with you, Daniel. The scholarship fund and the teacher grants, we can do. The community advisory board is going to require some structural changes, but we can do it." Daniel asked, "And the letter?" The 4th item, the personal acknowledgement. Richard looked down at the desk. When he looked up, something in his face was different. Not softer exactly, but opened up somehow, like a window in a room that had been closed too long. Richard answered, "I've already written it. 3 drafts. I want you to read it before it goes to the community organizations." He slid a folded letter across the desk. Daniel took it, read it, didn't speak for a moment. Daniel, and said, "This is good, Richard." Richard said, "I should have known better. I should have a lot of things." He stopped. That was as far as he went, but it was further than Daniel expected. Emily organized the dinner. Not a formal event, the same dining room in Lincoln Park, the same table, the same fireplace, but a smaller gathering this time. Just Richard and Patricia. Brendan was not invited. Uncle Roy was not invited. Just the 4 of them. Daniel brought the same wine he'd brought 3 years ago. Patricia noticed. She didn't say anything, but Emily saw her mother's eyes track to the bottle and hold there for a moment. Dinner was quieter than usual. The conversation moved around the edges of what everyone was thinking until Richard set down his fork and looked at Daniel directly. Richard said, "I owe you something I should have given you a long time ago." Daniel waited. Richard said, "I misjudged you, completely. I made assumptions about your value based on your income. That dinner, 3 years ago, you handled it better than I deserved." Daniel said, "You didn't know me." Richard said, "I didn't try to." Daniel said, "Richard, I want to tell you something. I've never done what I do for approval. Not yours, not anyone's. But I'll be honest with you. The way you treated Emily at that table, the way you made her feel like she'd chosen wrong, that stayed with her. That's the part I'd ask you to think about." The room was very still. Richard said, after a long pause, "You're right. Emily, I'm sorry." Emily's mother reached across the table and took her daughter's hand. They sat like that for a moment. 4 people at a dinner table that had held something ugly 3 years ago and was holding something different now. The partnership between Caldwell Development and the Illinois Bridge Initiative was announced publicly in May. The Tribune ran a story on it. Not a front-page story, but a substantial feature in the business section. The headline was careful and measured, as Tribune headlines tend to be. Troubled developer partners with education nonprofit in community repair initiative. But the quote that traveled, the one people shared, the one that ended up in education policy circles and in a keynote at the National Education Conference, was Daniel's. A reporter had asked him how it felt to be partnering with a company that had caused harm in the same communities his program served. Daniel said, "The schools I work in are full of people who made mistakes and decided to do something about it. I don't think that redemption is only available to students. It's available to anyone willing to do the actual work. Our job is to make sure the work is real." The 100 scholarships were funded. The first 23 students were announced in June, first-generation college-goers from Inglewood, Austin, and North Lawndale. A photographer from the Tribune captured the announcement ceremony. Daniel stood at the back of the room, watching, not on stage, because this wasn't about him. It never had been. Richard Caldwell was also in the room. He sat in the third row. When the students' names were called and each one stood up, nervous, proud, in borrowed dress clothes and school uniforms, Richard watched with an expression that nobody who knew him before that year would have predicted. He looked like someone who was beginning to understand something. There is one more piece of this story that Emily told me, and I think it belongs here. Brendan, Emily's cousin, the one who smirked into his napkin at the first dinner, had worked at Caldwell Development for 3 years by the time the partnership was announced. He was 27 now, smart enough but untested, a young man who had confused proximity to his uncle's success with building his own. During the federal investigation, Brendan had been close enough to some of the Westbridge decisions to be uncomfortable. He hadn't done anything illegal, but he had looked away when he should have asked questions. He had signed off on things he didn't fully understand because it was easier than pushing back. The investigation scared him, genuinely scared him, in the way that makes people sit alone at night and think about who they want to be. Brendan went to see Daniel. He showed up at the bridge office without an appointment. Kyra, the assistant, almost turned him away, but he asked politely, said it was personal, and waited. Daniel saw him. They sat in the same office where Daniel had met with Richard. Brendan said, "I don't really have a reason to be here. I read what you've been doing, and I thought about that dinner 3 years ago. I laughed at you. I want to say I'm sorry." Daniel looked at him. The young man across the desk seemed smaller than he had at that table. Not in a bad way, in the way that people get smaller when they're being real. Daniel said, "I appreciate that, Brendan. What are you going to do with it?" Brendan said, "I don't know yet." Daniel said, "That's a fine place to start. Come back when you do." Brendan left. He came back 2 months later. He asked if Bridge needed help with their financial reporting and grant compliance. He said he'd do it pro bono on weekends. Daniel said yes. Brendan still works with Bridge on weekends. He's not doing it for redemption anymore. He's doing it because he found out he's actually good at it. I've told you about Daniel, about Richard, about the partnership and the scholarships and the letter. But the center of this story, the quiet center, is Emily. Because Emily made a choice at 28 that her family couldn't understand. She married a man who carried no status, no connections, no corner office. She married a man who went home smelling of chalk dust and spent his evenings grading papers instead of entertaining clients. She never asked Daniel to defend himself. She never told him he needed to prove something to her parents. She simply believed in him, the way you believe in someone when you've watched them move through the world and you know, in the specific and unfashionable way that love works, that their character is the realest thing you've ever been close to. After the partnership was announced, a journalist asked Emily, in a sidebar piece about Daniel, what she had seen in him that her family had missed at that first dinner. She thought about it for a moment. Emily said, "I think they were looking at what he had. I was looking at what he was. Those are different questions. They give you different answers." She paused. Emily said, "And honestly, the fact that he never tried to prove them wrong, that he just kept doing his work, that told me everything I needed to know. You can learn a lot about a person from how they respond when someone underestimates them. Daniel's response was to go build something." At their kitchen table, that same kitchen table where Daniel graded papers every night while Emily made dinner, there is now a framed piece of paper on the wall. It's not Daniel's teaching certificate. It's not a press clipping from the Tribune. It's a handwritten note from a student named Marcus, the one who almost dropped out at 16. That says, "Mr. Hayes, you showed up for me when nobody else would. I'm going to show up for someone too. That's the deal." Daniel put it on the wall because he says it's the only performance metric that matters. Here is what I want you to take away from Daniel and Emily's story. We live in a world that is very loud about success, about salaries, about titles, about the kind of achievement that fits neatly in a conversation at a dinner table in Lincoln Park. Richard Caldwell understood that world perfectly. He had built a career inside it, and he had raised his daughter inside it. And when a quiet Southside history teacher sat down at his mahogany table, he measured Daniel against that world and found him lacking. What Richard missed, what it took him 3 years and a federal investigation to begin to understand, is that there is a different kind of wealth, the kind that isn't visible at a dinner table, the kind that accumulates slowly in classrooms and late nights and proposals that get rejected 11 times, in the patience of a man who doesn't need the world to see him, to know his work is real. Daniel didn't wait for permission. He just kept building. And one day, the people who laughed at him needed what he had built. He didn't turn them away. He didn't make them beg. He didn't use the moment to humiliate them the way they had humiliated him. He drafted a proposal. He set terms that protected the people who had actually been harmed. He signed the deal and went back to his classroom. Because that's who Daniel Hayes is, not a man who waited for a moment of triumph. A man who was too busy working to notice he'd already won. Before you go, I want to ask you something. Is there a Daniel in your life? Someone who is quietly doing work that the people around them don't fully see? Someone who has been underestimated, maybe at a dinner table, maybe in a meeting room, maybe in a family conversation, where someone said, essentially, that's not enough. If there is, I hope this story gives you the language to see them more clearly. And if you are that person, if you are the one sitting at the table while someone measures you in the wrong currency, I hope you heard this. Keep going. The work is the answer. It always has been. Drop a comment right now. What would you have done in Daniel's position at that first dinner? Would you have stayed quiet or would you have spoken up? There's no wrong answer. I read every single one. If this story resonated with you, if you found yourself nodding along or thinking of someone you love or feeling something you didn't expect, please subscribe. Not because the algorithm needs it, because I have more stories exactly like this one. Stories about people who were counted out. Stories about the kind of quiet strength that doesn't look like strength until the very end. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, share this with someone who needs to hear it today.